They came from the deserts of North Africa, men who once believed they served an invincible army. The banners of the Africa Corps had once carried the confidence of conquest, the same confidence that had driven them across Libya and into Egypt under the burning sun. But by early 1943, that confidence was gone. The battles of El Alamein and Tunisia had shattered the myth of German invincibility. Thousands of weary soldiers, some still teenagers, others veterans of years of fighting, found themselves surrounded by Allied forces. For them, the war was over, but what awaited them was beyond imagination. As the last Axis pockets in Tunisia collapsed, Allied troops gathered nearly 250,000 prisoners. German officers were stunned by the efficiency of the capture operation, the speed with which the Allies processed, fed, and transported such an enormous number of men. Even in defeat, they noticed something unsettling. The Allies, particularly the Americans, seemed to have endless supplies. Trucks rolled by in columns, filled with rations, water, and ammunition. The prisoners looked on, wondering how an enemy could maintain such abundance so far from home. At first, rumors spread among the captured Germans that they would be taken to England, perhaps to work in mines or labor camps. Others whispered darker predictions, that the Americans would send them to Siberia or to factories to be used as slave labor. The officers tried to maintain discipline, but fear grew. None of them had any idea that their destination would be the United States. When the orders finally came, it was done with typical American efficiency. The prisoners were marched to ports under heavy guard, loaded onto transport ships, and kept under strict secrecy. The men crowded into the holds of Liberty ships, their uniforms still covered in North African dust. They were exhausted, sunburned, and uncertain. But beneath the anxiety, there was also curiosity. Many had seen America only through propaganda posters that depicted it as a land of chaos, crime, and racial division. A decadent society of jazz and capitalism that would collapse under pressure. Yet, as the engines roared and the ships began the long journey westward, even the most loyal among them wondered what truth lay behind those images. The voyage across the Atlantic was long and disorienting. The prisoners had little to do but talk, play cards, and speculate about their fate. Some tried to calculate where they were based on the stars seen through small vents in the hull. The ocean stretched endlessly, and the monotony was broken only by the constant hum of engines and the sound of guards pacing above deck. Despite the war still raging, the Americans treated the prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. They were given decent food, water, and even medical care for the wounded. This alone puzzled many Germans. They had expected humiliation and revenge, but what they found was order, even kindness. Occasionally, an officer or interpreter would speak with the American guards, asking questions about where they were going. The answers were vague. "You'll find out soon." The secrecy only deepened the mystery. Some suspected they might be headed to South America. Others, recalling rumors spread in the Africa Corps, imagined vast desert camps in the middle of the American continent. After 2 weeks at sea, the ships finally approached land. At first, the prisoners thought they were dreaming. Through the narrow portholes and cracks, they saw a coastline glowing with electric light. It was nighttime, yet the horizon shimmered like daylight. There were cities vast, bright, and alive. Even during wartime, when European cities were darkened to avoid bombers, America seemed unafraid. To men used to blackouts, ruined ports, and rationing, the sight of illuminated skylines felt almost unreal. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "When we first saw New York, it was as if we had landed on another planet. As dawn came, they saw harbors filled with ships of every size, cargo vessels, destroyers, tugboats, ferries, and tankers. Cranes moved constantly, loading and unloading supplies. The sheer activity was overwhelming. They could hear the rhythmic pounding of machinery, the whistles of steam, and the shouts of workers." For the first time, the prisoners began to understand that America's strength was not in its armies alone, but in its ability to build, move, and sustain. When the gangplanks were lowered, American military police lined the docks. The prisoners were marched off the ships, their boots echoing against the concrete. Some walked stiffly, trying to maintain dignity. Others simply stared around in silence. There were factories stretching for miles, railways filled with freight cars, and endless rows of trucks. Even the smallest harbor seemed more industrially advanced than any they had known in Germany. Processing began immediately. American officers recorded each prisoner's information, name, rank, serial number, and unit. Medical inspections followed. The efficiency of the process left an impression. One German officer remarked quietly to another, "If they organized their war effort as well as they organized this, then perhaps we were doomed from the start." After processing, they were loaded again, this time onto long trains. The trains were clean, well-maintained, and fast. The prisoners were divided by rank, with officers kept separate from enlisted men. As the trains began to move inland, the Germans looked out the windows and were struck by what they saw. Town after town passed by, each alive with activity. Fields stretched to the horizon, filled with machines instead of horses. Every small town had paved roads, schools, and stores. Even during wartime, there were no signs of deprivation. Women walked freely, children played, and markets were full. Many of the men felt a deep confusion. They had been told that America was weak, that its people were lazy, its democracy fragile, and its industry driven by greed. Yet the scenes outside their train windows told another story entirely. Everything seemed organized, productive, and confident. There were no bomb craters, no ruins, no signs of fear. The air itself felt different, calm, untouched by the devastation of war. Some of the prisoners began to whisper among themselves that they might be safer here than they had ever been in Germany. Others refused to believe it. For the most loyal among them, the propaganda was too deeply rooted. They dismissed what they saw as deception, a facade meant to intimidate them. But the longer they traveled, the harder it became to maintain that belief. As the trains crossed states, some prisoners began to understand the scale of the country. The distances were immense. They traveled for days, watching forests turn to plains and plains to farmlands so vast they seemed endless. At mealtimes, American guards served them food that was simple but plentiful. White bread, meat, butter, and coffee, luxuries rare in wartime Europe. A few prisoners asked the guards if this was special treatment for them. The guards laughed and said, "This is what everyone eats." Letters began to arrive from home. Many were censored, but the tone was clear. Germany was struggling. Cities were being bombed, supplies were scarce, and morale was collapsing. In contrast, the prisoners were eating well, sleeping safely, and witnessing a society untouched by war. The contrast gnawed at them. A few weeks into their confinement, work details began. Selected groups were sent out to nearby farms to assist with labor shortages. The moment they stepped outside the barbed wire, another wave of shock awaited them. They saw farms larger than entire German provinces, filled with tractors, trucks, and harvesters operating with clockwork precision. American farmers worked confidently, often alongside their wives and daughters, treating the prisoners not as enemies but as hired hands. Some even shared meals with them after long days of work. One prisoner later wrote, "In Germany, a farmer works from dawn to dusk with little to show. Here, even the smallest farm is rich. It is not war that makes them powerful. It is their system." Bit by bit, the image of America they had carried began to crack. The propaganda they had heard, that democracy was weak, that capitalism was chaos, no longer matched what they saw with their own eyes. Not all prisoners accepted the truth easily. Among them were loyal Nazis who tried to maintain ideological control. They held secret meetings, whispered warnings about enemy lies, and punished those who showed admiration for America. But the cracks widened nonetheless. Every train ride, every farm, every conversation with an American guard chipped away at old beliefs. For many, the journey from the deserts of Africa to the heart of America became a journey of realization. Not forced, not propagandized, but quietly transformative. They had entered captivity believing they were superior. Now, for the first time, they began to question not just their defeat, but the very foundation of what they had been taught to believe. By the end of that first year, Thousands of German soldiers were scattered across more than 500 camps in 46 states. From Texas to Minnesota, from Georgia to California, they became silent witnesses to the industrial and moral power of the United States. None of them could have known that their captivity would become one of the most successful re-education efforts in modern history. And though the barbed wire still surrounded them, something deeper was already changing inside their minds. The journey across America was unlike anything the prisoners had ever experienced. To them, the country seemed endless. For men used to the compact geography of Europe, where borders and languages changed within a few hours' drive, the sheer size of the United States was overwhelming. Days passed and the train kept rolling, cutting through farmlands, towns, and forests that stretched far beyond sight. The prisoners looked out the windows and saw a land at peace, a country so vast that the war seemed distant, almost unreal. They passed through small towns where families gathered near the tracks, watching the long convoys of prisoner trains with curiosity. Some waved, others simply stared. Children pointed at the soldiers behind the windows, not with fear or hatred, but with innocent wonder. The prisoners noticed this and whispered among themselves. In Germany, civilians would never be allowed near enemy prisoners. Here it seemed normal. The guards remained calm, professional, even friendly. There was discipline but not cruelty. The German officers were perplexed. This was not how victors were supposed to behave. At each stop, the trains were resupplied with food and water. The meals were plentiful, though simple: sandwiches, fruit, coffee, and sometimes warm stew served in metal containers. The Americans followed strict rations, but even under wartime restrictions, what they provided to prisoners was more generous than what most German civilians could find at home. The prisoners could hardly believe it. Many began to wonder what kind of nation could afford to feed its captives so well while still fighting a global war. As the trains rolled deeper inland, the scenery began to change. The coastal cities gave way to open plains and small industrial towns. The prisoners noticed factories everywhere: textile mills, assembly plants, rail yards, and depots that seemed to operate day and night. Smoke rose from chimneys, trains loaded with goods moved in every direction, and the steady hum of work never stopped. Even the smallest towns appeared to have electricity, paved roads, and cars. It was a picture of relentless productivity. For many prisoners, this journey through America's industrial landscape marked the first crack in the image they had been taught to believe. The propaganda they had absorbed for years, that the United States was a land of chaos, driven by greed and racial conflict, did not match what they saw outside the windows. Instead, they saw an organized, confident, and astonishingly efficient society. In one of the trains, a former N.Z. officer named Karl Wegner sat quietly, taking notes in a small pocket journal. Before his capture, he had been a political instructor in the Afrika Korps, responsible for maintaining ideological discipline among the troops. His job had been to remind them that they were fighting for the survival of civilization against the decay of democracy. But as the train sped through the heartland, Wegner wrote something he would never dare speak aloud. The Americans fight with machines, not hate. They work with unity, not fear. Their power is not in ideology but in motion. After several days of travel, the prisoners reached their destinations, the camps that would house them for the next months or even years. Some arrived in the south, where the sun baked the fields of Texas and Louisiana. Others were sent north to the forests of Wisconsin and Minnesota, where snow blanketed the ground in winter. Still others found themselves in the vast open spaces of the Midwest, Kansas, Iowa, and Nebraska, where they were surrounded by fields that seemed to touch the sky. Each camp had its own atmosphere, shaped by local culture and geography, but they all shared the same structure: barracks, mess halls, workshops, and fences. The fences were high, topped with barbed wire, but inside the perimeters, life followed a rhythm that surprised the Germans. There were routines, work schedules, and even leisure time. American officers ran the camps with discipline, yet they also encouraged order through respect rather than intimidation. In most camps, the prisoners were given work assignments. America faced a severe labor shortage during the war. Millions of men were overseas, and farms, factories, and timber operations needed hands. The War Department saw an opportunity. The prisoners could work under guard, easing the strain on the home front. It was a practical decision, but it also had unintended consequences. The work became the first bridge between two worlds that had been enemies only months before. On the farms, prisoners worked alongside American civilians. First, both sides were cautious. The farmers were wary of the men who, only a short time ago, had been part of an army fighting against their sons and husbands. The Germans, for their part, were unsure how they would be treated. But the interactions quickly became routine. The farmers learned that the Germans were not monsters, and the prisoners discovered that the Americans were not the savages they had been told about. One farmer in Nebraska recalled years later, "They worked hard, never complained. Some of them were just boys. We gave them lunch in the shade, and they thanked us like we'd done them a favor." The prisoners were paid small wages, most of which were held in accounts to be collected after the war. Still, the Americans allowed them to buy items from the camp canteens: cigarettes, soap, stationery, even chocolate. For many, it was the first time they had access to such abundance. A single chocolate bar in Germany by that time was almost priceless. Here, it was something you could buy with a few work coupons. The psychological effect was profound. Slowly, the prisoners began to compare what they had been told about democracy with what they experienced firsthand. They noticed that the guards did not shout or humiliate them. Orders were given firmly but fairly. If a man fell ill, he was taken to the camp infirmary and treated by American doctors. They were allowed to write home regularly, to receive mail, and even to organize their own concerts or theater shows inside the camps. The guards often treated them as fellow soldiers rather than as criminals. They shared cigarettes, exchanged stories, and sometimes discussed the war. There were boundaries, of course. Any attempt to escape was punished, but the general atmosphere remained unexpectedly humane. Many of the guards were themselves farm boys or factory workers who had little hatred for the Germans. Their job was to keep order, not to seek revenge. Letters from prisoners to their families in Germany reveal this transformation in quiet, honest language. One wrote, "We are treated well. It is strange. The Americans are not like the monsters our leaders described. They are calm, confident, and proud of their country. You can feel that here." Another letter, intercepted and later translated by the U.S. military, contained a line that summarized the shifting mindset. "If Germany loses this war, it will be because we underestimated the Americans. They are not decadent. They are disciplined and free at the same time, something we never understood." Within months, most prisoners settled into the rhythm of camp life. They woke at sunrise, worked during the day, and returned by evening. On Sundays, chaplains conducted religious services. The Americans encouraged cultural activities, hoping to keep morale stable and prevent radicalization. This included allowing prisoners to form orchestras, sports teams, and discussion clubs. Some camps even had small libraries filled with German-language books donated by local universities. The effect of these policies was not lost on the prisoners. Even those who remained loyal to the regime could not ignore the evidence before them. They began to see that, in America, freedom did not mean disorder. The system worked precisely because it trusted individuals to take responsibility, something alien to those raised under authoritarian rule. In the evenings, the prisoners often gathered in the barracks to talk about what they had seen. They discussed the vastness of the farms, the efficiency of the factories, the ease with which Americans seemed to live despite the war. Some of the older men, who had fought in the First World War, compared their experiences and noted how America had changed since 1918. Back then, it had been a rising power. Now it was an unstoppable one. The young soldiers listened in silence, trying to reconcile what they were learning with the ideology that had defined their lives. They had been told that democracy was weak because it allowed dissent. But here, they saw strength, not in unity imposed by fear, but in cooperation born of freedom. American officers, for their part, understood the psychological value of this exposure. They made sure that prisoners saw how the system functioned. They were taken past working factories, through rail depots filled with supplies, and sometimes through towns where store shelves were stocked with goods. The message was subtle but powerful. While Germany rationed every ounce of food and fuel, America was producing more than it could consume. In one camp in Texas, the prisoners were allowed to help repair military vehicles. There, they saw lines of new trucks, jeeps, and tanks waiting to be shipped overseas. The pace of production stunned them. Back home, the Luftwaffe was running short of fuel, and factories were being destroyed by bombers. Here, the assembly lines ran day and night without interruption. It was a revelation that struck at the core of their beliefs about superiority. One technician, who had worked in a German aircraft plant before the war, was assigned to a repair detail near an American airfield. He later wrote, "They build planes faster than we can imagine. Every hour something takes off, something lands, something new is rolled out. There is no shortage of anything. It is like a river that never stops flowing." That simple exchange echoed across the barracks that night. For men who had lived under a regime where a single careless word could lead to imprisonment, the concept of free speech seemed almost impossible. Yet they were hearing it directly from an American soldier who spoke of it casually, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. In time, word of these experiences began to spread among the prisoners. Each new work detail, each encounter with American life, added another layer of understanding. They realized that America's strength did not come from fear or control, but from confidence, a belief in its own system that allowed it to thrive even in war. The transformation was slow and quiet, but undeniable. The men who had once marched proudly under the swastika began to see that the power they had worshipped was an illusion. Real strength, they were learning, came not from domination but from cooperation, from a society that trusted its people and rewarded their effort. By the end of 1943, the camps were functioning smoothly. The initial suspicion had given way to a kind of uneasy coexistence. The prisoners were still captives, but they no longer felt like enemies in the same sense. They were observers of a different kind of world, one they had been taught to despise but now could not ignore. For the Americans, it was simply good administration. For the prisoners, it was the beginning of a quiet revolution of the mind. They had come as conquerors who had failed, but they were slowly becoming witnesses to a nation whose real victory lay not on the battlefield, but in the factories, farms, and freedoms that surrounded them. And as winter settled across the continent, the lights of the American towns still glowed bright, unshaded, confident, and alive. A constant reminder that they were now inside the heart of something far greater than they had ever imagined. The barbed wire fences stood tall, stretching around the perimeter of each camp, but inside them, life began to take on a strange sense of normalcy. The German prisoners had arrived expecting the worst: punishment, humiliation, perhaps even starvation. What they found instead was routine, discipline, and a degree of comfort that none of them could have predicted. It was confinement, yes, but it was also stability. Every morning began the same way. A whistle blew at dawn. The prisoners filed out of the barracks, their boots crunching against gravel as they lined up for roll call. American guards counted them methodically, clipboard in hand, while the camp loudspeakers crackled with orders. Breakfast followed: oatmeal, bread, sometimes eggs or sausage when supplies allowed. To men who had survived on half rations during the final days in North Africa, it was a feast. The Americans kept the camps organized like small towns. There were kitchens, infirmaries, recreation areas, and even chapels. The barracks were simple wooden buildings heated by potbelly stoves in the winter and ventilated through open windows in summer. Inside, bunks were lined neatly in rows, each with a mattress, blanket, and small locker. Compared to the field conditions they had endured in Tunisia, the camps felt almost civilized. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, but the Americans went beyond that. The War Department believed that good conditions would not only prevent unrest but would also demonstrate the moral difference between democratic America and totalitarian Germany. This was a war of ideology as much as of armies. Every meal served, every fair command given, became part of a quiet campaign to prove that freedom and order could coexist. Within weeks, life settled into rhythm. Work assignments, meals, roll calls, and leisure periods gave structure to the days. The camps even had libraries stocked with donated books, many in German, and educational programs that taught English, mathematics, and history. The U.S. Army called these intellectual recreation activities, But they were something more profound, the seeds of re-education. The men were encouraged, though never forced, to participate. Some did so out of boredom, others out of genuine curiosity. They attended lectures organized by captured German officers who were secretly supportive of democratic ideas, and sometimes by visiting American professors. The curriculum was carefully designed. It did not preach, nor did it attack Germany directly. Instead, it exposed the prisoners to new ideas, the principles of democracy, the value of individual rights, and the foundations of a free press. The discussions were often tense. Many prisoners still held strong ideological beliefs, and arguments erupted over the failures of leadership, the causes of the war, and whether Germany could ever rebuild without its authoritarian structure. Yet even the most loyal among them began to sense something uncomfortable, that their arguments sounded weaker than they once had. One prisoner later recalled, "We were given books that explained democracy in a way that made sense. It was not propaganda like we had known in Germany. It was simply information, and that was enough to make us think." Within weeks, life settled into rhythm. Work assignments, meals, roll calls, and leisure periods gave structure to the days. The camps even had libraries stocked with donated books, many in German, and educational programs that taught English, mathematics, and history. The U.S. Army called these intellectual recreation activities, but they were something more profound, the seeds of re-education. The men were encouraged, though never forced, to participate. Some did so out of boredom, others out of genuine curiosity. They attended lectures organized by captured German officers who were secretly supportive of democratic ideas, and sometimes by visiting American professors. The curriculum was carefully designed. It did not preach, nor did it attack Germany directly. Instead, it exposed the prisoners to new ideas, the principles of democracy, the value of individual rights, and the foundations of a free press. The discussions were often tense. Many prisoners still held strong ideological beliefs, and arguments erupted over the failures of leadership, the causes of the war, and whether Germany could ever rebuild without its authoritarian structure. Yet even the most loyal among them began to sense something uncomfortable, that their arguments sounded weaker than they once had. One prisoner later recalled, "We were given books that explained democracy in a way that made sense. It was not propaganda like we had known in Germany. It was simply information, and that was enough to make us think." Music played a significant role in daily life as well. Many prisoners had brought harmonicas, violins, or guitars with them, and soon entire orchestras were formed. The Americans often attended the concerts, clapping politely after each song. The prisoners played both German folk music and American songs they learned from guards. "You Are My Sunshine," "Blue Skies," "Chattanooga Choo Choo." The music created a strange harmony between captor and captive, a shared space where ideology faded for a moment. Some camps even organized art exhibitions, displaying sketches, paintings, and carvings made by the prisoners. American visitors were often stunned by the craftsmanship. The artwork revealed not defiance, but reflection, landscapes of peace, portraits of home, and depictions of a life that seemed far removed from the war's brutality. The guards began to see the prisoners not as enemies, but as men caught in history's machinery. For the prisoners, the most powerful lessons came not from books or classes, but from observation. They watched how the guards interacted with one another, officers and enlisted men alike. In Germany, rank defined every social interaction. In America, it seemed different. A sergeant could speak casually to a lieutenant, even disagree with him without fear. Orders were followed, but authority did not demand worship. It was to them a revelation. The longer they stayed, the more contradictions they noticed between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing. In Nazi Germany, propaganda had insisted that democracy was weak because it allowed differences of opinion. But in the camps, they saw that disagreements were part of the system's strength. American officers debated policies openly, guards discussed politics without fear of punishment, and newspapers printed stories that criticized the government without consequence. One camp commander once said to a group of prisoners during a discussion session, "In our country, the people are the government. We can disagree with it because it belongs to us. The statement stunned the room into silence. It was a concept entirely alien to men who had grown up under a regime where obedience was survival. Letters from Germany continued to arrive, each one reinforcing the growing sense of contrast. Families wrote of shortages, bombings, and fear. The prisoners read about air raids that had turned cities into ruins, about rationing that left children hungry. Meanwhile, they were eating full meals, reading books, and listening to radios that broadcast jazz and news from around the world. Some felt guilty about their relative comfort. Others felt angry that their country had lied to them. Gradually, the fences around the camps began to feel less like barriers and more like boundaries of safety. Inside them, the men were protected from the destruction consuming Europe. They began to call the camps the Golden Cage. They were prisoners, but prisoners in a land that seemed untouched by the chaos of war. The Americans also began experimenting with a more deliberate form of re-education known as the intellectual diversion program. It included film screenings, lectures, and discussions designed to challenge authoritarian thinking. They showed newsreels of American life, workers in factories, students in universities, citizens voting in elections. The prisoners watched in silence. The images of prosperity, racial diversity, and unity under democracy contradicted everything they had been taught. But the Americans were careful not to humiliate them. The goal was not to force guilt, but to inspire understanding. They knew that transformation would come not through coercion, but through recognition, through the quiet realization that the system they had fought against worked better than the one they had fought for. By 1944, this transformation was visible in subtle ways. Camp commanders noted improved discipline and morale. Fewer escape attempts occurred, and even minor rule violations decreased. When asked why they didn't try to flee, most prisoners gave the same answer. Where would they go? The vastness of America made escape nearly impossible, but more than that, many no longer wanted to. The camps had become places of reflection rather than resistance. In one camp in Arkansas, a group of prisoners volunteered to help build a local school playground. The work detail was supervised, but the cooperation was genuine. When the project was completed, local children came to play, waving shyly at the Germans who watched from behind the fence. That simple moment, of laughter and sunlight and innocence, left a deep impression. One of the guards wrote in his diary that evening, "For a moment, you could not tell who was enemy and who was friend. Even the most hardened among the prisoners began to soften." A few former officers who had once preached racial superiority now found themselves helping African American farmhands during harvest work. They noticed that, though America had its own inequalities, the society allowed discussion and change. That openness was foreign to them, but it stirred something, the beginning of doubt. Doubt became the seed of transformation. It spread quietly, not through speeches or propaganda, but through lived experience. Every fair act, every display of kindness, every sign of abundance added another crack to the ideological wall that had been built in their minds. Some American officers understood this better than any formal program could express. Colonel Ralph Parker, who oversaw several POW facilities, later said, "We didn't have to preach democracy. We just let them see it." As the months passed, the prisoners began to take part in camp elections for leadership positions. They organized councils to mediate disputes, manage supplies, and coordinate activities. For the first time, many of them experienced democratic decision-making in action. Votes were held, debates conducted, and resolutions passed. The process was simple but profound. In small, enclosed worlds surrounded by fences, men who had once fought to destroy democracy were now practicing it. Meanwhile, outside the camps, the war continued with relentless force. News of D-Day reached them in June 1944. The Americans allowed them to hear radio reports confirming the Allied landings in France. There was shock, disbelief, and then silence. The realization that the tide of war had turned was undeniable. For some, it marked the end of denial. For others, it deepened the sense of loss. As the war dragged on, the contrast between their peaceful confinement and the devastation in Europe became unbearable. Some prisoners wept openly upon hearing of their cities being bombed. Others became withdrawn, consumed by guilt and shame. But even in their grief, they began to see the value of what surrounded them: stability, order, humanity. By the end of that year, a quiet transformation had taken root in hundreds of thousands of minds. The camps had become more than places of detention. They were classrooms of freedom, laboratories of democracy, and mirrors reflecting the failures of totalitarianism. The men who had once marched with absolute certainty now spent their nights reading, discussing, and questioning. They did not yet know it, but within those fences, the first generation of post-war German Democrats was being formed, not through force, but through exposure to a better way of life. And while the war still raged across oceans and continents, inside those American camps, another kind of victory was being quietly won. It was not measured in battles or territory, but in the hearts and minds of men who began to understand, perhaps for the first time, what freedom truly meant. Winter came early to many of the camps in late 1944. Frost covered the barbed wire in the mornings, and the prisoners woke to the sound of wind rattling through wooden walls. For the men of the Afrika Korps and Wehrmacht divisions, it was a strange experience. They were far from the desert heat and the ruins of Europe. In America, the war felt distant, like a storm that could be heard but not seen. Inside the camps, life had evolved. The routines were now second nature. Roll calls, meals, work assignments, and education programs filled the days with structure. But beneath that order, something deeper was unfolding. A transformation of identity and belief that even the Americans had not fully anticipated. The prisoners had arrived as soldiers of the Third Reich. They carried within them the values, pride, and prejudices that had been cultivated through years of indoctrination. Yet the longer they remained in the United States, the more those ideas began to crumble, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of another reality. One that challenged everything they had been taught about power, progress, and civilization. For many, the turning point came not from lectures or official programs, but from simple observation. On work details, they were driven to factories, lumber mills, and farms where they saw ordinary Americans working side by side regardless of background. In some places, they even worked under the supervision of women, something unheard of in the rigid, patriarchal world of Nazi Germany. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "We were told that Americans were lazy and undisciplined, but they work harder than we ever did, and they do it with laughter." The realization that the supposed decadent democracies were, in truth, efficient and industrious left many prisoners quietly shaken. The image of America as a nation of weakness had been a lie. Here, they saw factories operating day and night, producing an endless flow of machines, trucks, and weapons. They learned that some plants turned out an entire bomber every hour, that highways stretched farther than the roads of all Germany combined, and that even farmers used tractors larger than some tanks. The scale of American industry was incomprehensible to men who had come from a nation constantly struggling for raw materials. In one camp, prisoners were taken on supervised visits to nearby manufacturing facilities. The noise, the organization, and the sheer abundance of resources stunned them. One engineer among the prisoners reportedly stood in silence for several minutes before saying quietly, "Now I understand why we cannot win." The psychological effect of this exposure was profound. It was not humiliation they felt, but revelation. They had believed themselves to be part of a superior race leading the world into a new order. Yet here, in the land they had been told was weak and corrupt, they saw prosperity, freedom, and power on a scale their leaders had never described. That contrast began to erode the foundations of blind loyalty. Ideology, once absolute, started to fracture under the weight of reality. The camps, in this sense, became places of awakening. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "We were told that Americans were lazy and undisciplined, but they work harder than we ever did, and they do it with laughter." The realization that the supposed decadent democracies were, in truth, efficient and industrious left many prisoners quietly shaken. The image of America as a nation of weakness had been a lie. Here, they saw factories operating day and night, producing an endless flow of machines, trucks, and weapons. They learned that some plants turned out an entire bomber every hour, that highways stretched farther than the roads of all Germany combined, and that even farmers used tractors larger than some tanks. The scale of American industry was incomprehensible to men who had come from a nation constantly struggling for raw materials. In one camp, prisoners were taken on supervised visits to nearby manufacturing facilities. The noise, the organization, and the sheer abundance of resources stunned them. One engineer among the prisoners reportedly stood in silence for several minutes before saying quietly, "Now I understand why we cannot win." The psychological effect of this exposure was profound. It was not humiliation they felt, but revelation. They had believed themselves to be part of a superior race leading the world into a new order. Yet here, in the land they had been told was weak and corrupt, they saw prosperity, freedom, and power on a scale their leaders had never described. That contrast began to erode the foundations of blind loyalty. Ideology, once absolute, started to fracture under the weight of reality. The camps, in this sense, became places of awakening. The Americans, aware of this shift, expanded their educational and cultural programs. Camp libraries were stocked with thousands of books, everything from Mark Twain to technical manuals, from American history to world literature. Prisoners who had once refused to read anything outside German authors now devoured English-language works, eager to understand the society around them. Some of the most popular titles were about the American Revolution, Abraham Lincoln, and the U.S. Constitution. The themes of freedom, justice, and equality resonated deeply, especially among younger prisoners who had grown disillusioned with the failures of their own government. They debated these ideas long into the night, sometimes with intensity, sometimes with quiet wonder. Radio broadcasts were another powerful influence. The prisoners listened to American news, swing music, and public speeches. They heard President Roosevelt's words about the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. For men raised under a regime where speech could be fatal and fear was constant, these ideas sounded almost unreal. Yet they were hearing them in a place where those freedoms existed even during wartime. It was during this period that the re-education efforts took on new depth. American officers and civilian specialists began conducting discussion sessions under a program later known as the Special Projects Division. The idea was not to convert prisoners by force, but to let them reach their own conclusions through exposure and dialogue. In one such session, a professor from a nearby university spoke about the dangers of totalitarianism. He drew diagrams comparing systems of government, one showing the pyramid of dictatorship, the other a circle representing democracy. The prisoners listened intently. When the professor asked them which structure they believed could survive war, most chose the pyramid. But after weeks of observation and conversation, the answers began to change. By early 1945, many prisoners had started to express admiration for American democracy. They didn't see it as perfect, but they saw it as human, adaptable, self-correcting, and alive. One wrote in a letter home, "Here the people question everything, and that, perhaps, is their secret." At the same time, the Americans were careful to balance this intellectual engagement with meaningful work. The War Department realized that idleness could lead to unrest, so most prisoners were assigned labor duties that contributed indirectly to the war effort. Never combat production, but agriculture, forestry, or public works. On farms across the Midwest and South, prisoners harvested crops, repaired fences, and loaded hay. Many American farmers, facing labor shortages because their sons were at war, came to rely on the German workers. At first, local communities viewed them with suspicion or hostility. But as weeks passed, attitudes softened. The farmers discovered that the prisoners were hardworking, polite, and grateful. In turn, the Germans were astonished by the generosity of people they had once considered enemies. They were invited into barns for coffee, given extra food during holidays, and treated with a civility that went beyond the requirements of the Geneva Convention. One story often repeated among prisoners was of a farmer's wife who baked bread for the work crew each week. When the guards told her she didn't have to, she replied, "They're human, aren't they?" That simple gesture became symbolic of something greater, a quiet act of humanity that no ideology could erase. These interactions with civilians were among the most transformative experiences for the prisoners. They saw that ordinary Americans, even those who had lost sons in the war, could still treat their captives with decency. It dismantled the image of the ruthless enemy that Nazi propaganda had built. The psychological effect was unmistakable. Letters intercepted by censors revealed a shift in tone. The defiant language of 1943 was replaced by humility and introspection by 1945. One prisoner wrote to his wife, "If our enemies can treat us like this, perhaps we were fighting the wrong war." The Americans understood the significance of this change. Military psychologists noted that the prisoners' morale improved not because they expected release soon, but because they had found a sense of purpose and dignity. They were working, learning, and, for the first time in years, thinking freely. Meanwhile, the war in Europe was approaching its final act. News reached the camps of the Allied advance across the Rhine, the fall of cities once considered impregnable, and the discovery of concentration camps that revealed horrors beyond imagination. When photographs of those camps began circulating, the impact was devastating. Some prisoners refused to believe them, insisting they were fabrications. Others wept in silence. A few turned away, unable to confront the reality of what had been done in their nation's name. Some of the officers overseeing the camps began to note that the prisoners now seemed older, not in years but in spirit. The arrogance of conquest had given way to reflection. The men spent their evenings quietly, reading or talking in low voices. The camp orchestras played softer tunes. Even the guards sensed a change in atmosphere. Less tension, more resignation, and, strangely, more peace. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the announcement spread quickly through every camp in America. There were no cheers, no riots, no celebrations, only silence. For many, it was as if a lifetime had ended. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years of glory had lasted barely 12. That night, the camp loudspeakers played the Star-Spangled Banner, followed by a moment of quiet. Some prisoners stood at attention out of respect. Others bowed their heads. One guard later recalled, "You could feel the weight of history pressing on that silence." In the weeks that followed, the camps entered a new phase. The prisoners were no longer enemy soldiers. They were men without a nation, waiting to learn their fate. The U.S. government faced the complex task of repatriation, returning hundreds of thousands of POWs to a shattered Germany that barely existed as a functioning state. But before they could go home, the Americans intensified their re-education efforts. They wanted these men to carry with them the values they had witnessed in the United States. To that end, they introduced a series of special publications, small newspapers and pamphlets written in German that explained the principles of democracy, civic responsibility, and human rights. The most notable of these was a magazine titled Der Ruf, or The Call. It was produced by German prisoners who had embraced democratic ideals and was distributed across camps. The articles were thoughtful and honest, addressing Germany's future with a tone of accountability rather than accusation. They spoke of rebuilding not just cities but minds, of creating a Germany that could stand among free nations without falling back into tyranny. One editorial read, "We have seen with our own eyes that democracy is not chaos. It is order through freedom, strength through cooperation, and justice through compassion." That message resonated deeply. Even those who had once scoffed at American values began to see them not as foreign, but as desirable. The transformation was nearly complete. As summer turned to autumn, preparations for repatriation began. The prisoners were issued clean uniforms marked POW, given medical checkups, and informed that they would soon be sent home. For many, the news was bittersweet. They longed to see their families, yet feared what awaited them in the ruins of their homeland. On their final days in camp, farewell ceremonies were often held. American officers addressed the departing men, thanking them for their cooperation and wishing them peace. In some cases, local citizens who had worked alongside the prisoners came to say goodbye. There were handshakes, sometimes tears. One farmer reportedly gave his favorite prisoner a Bible with the words, "To freedom through faith," written inside the cover. When the transports finally arrived, the men marched out in orderly lines, carrying their few belongings. As the trucks pulled away, many looked back at the camps that had once been symbols of defeat but had become, in a strange way, places of rebirth. They were not the same men who had arrived 2 years earlier under the banner of conquest. They were witnesses to a truth that no amount of propaganda could erase, that freedom, fairness, and dignity were stronger than any ideology built on fear. Among them were men who would later become teachers, journalists, and even government officials in post-war Germany. Some would help shape the new democratic institutions that emerged from the ashes of the old regime. They carried with them lessons learned behind barbed wire in a foreign land, lessons about humanity, responsibility, and the true meaning of strength. America's victory had not ended with military triumph. It extended into the realm of ideas, proving that decency could defeat hatred, and that a nation's greatest weapon was not its arsenal, but its principles. And in those quiet, fenced-in fields scattered across the United States, that victory had taken root, one mind, one heart, one man at a time. The long trains carrying the German prisoners of war rumbled eastward through the American heartland, passing endless miles of farmland, rivers, and towns that still stood untouched by war. For many of the men staring out from the boxcar windows, this was the last glimpse they would ever have of the United States, a country that had conquered them not only on the battlefield, but within their minds. The journey home was filled with silence. Some prisoners tried to write letters. Others simply watched the countryside roll by. They knew that when they arrived back in Europe, they would face a world utterly different from the one they had left behind. The Reich was gone. Its leaders were dead or awaiting trial. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne lay in ruins. Millions were homeless. Families had been scattered, lives erased. As the trains approached the ports on the East Coast, Norfolk, New York, Boston, the atmosphere grew heavy. American guards distributed small food parcels and coffee, and officers gave short farewell speeches. Many of the prisoners shook hands with their captors, an act that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. Some even exchanged addresses, promising to write once the war's bitterness had faded. The ships that carried them across the Atlantic were the same Liberty vessels that had once ferried American soldiers to Europe. Now they were crowded with thousands of men returning to a homeland they barely recognized. The voyage was long and cold. The sea was rough. But the real turbulence was within, the turmoil of men trying to reconcile what they had seen in America with what awaited them in the ruins of Germany. When they arrived at the European ports, often in France or Britain before being transferred into the occupation zones, the shock was immediate. The destruction was beyond anything they had imagined. Harbors were choked with wreckage. Streets were lined with bombed-out buildings. Children with hollow eyes begged for food. The air itself smelled of ash and sorrow. For many, this was the moment when the full weight of the war's consequences fell upon them. The land they had once believed invincible was now a graveyard of its own ambitions. The contrast with the order and abundance of the United States could not have been greater. Some prisoners were not immediately returned to Germany. Instead, they were assigned to temporary labor duties in France or Britain to help rebuild infrastructure. It was part of the Allied plan to repair what the war had destroyed, using the manpower of the defeated. While conditions varied, many of these men carried with them the lessons they had learned in America: discipline, cooperation, and a new respect for human dignity. They worked diligently, often exceeding expectations. British and French supervisors noted their efficiency and their surprising humility. Gone was the arrogance of the early war years. These were men who had looked beyond propaganda and had seen another way of life. When repatriation finally began in earnest in 1946, the returning POWs entered a Germany divided among the Allied powers. The once mighty nation was now occupied, its government dismantled, its people demoralized. Hunger and homelessness were rampant. Inflation had erased savings, and the black market had become the only functioning economy. The returning soldiers were met not with parades, but with suspicion. Many civilians resented them for having surrendered rather than dying in battle. Others saw them as lucky for having survived captivity in comfort compared to the suffering endured at home. Yet slowly, stories began to spread. Stories of what they had seen and experienced in the United States. At first, few believed them. When the former prisoners spoke of American farms the size of towns, of factories that produced planes by the hour, and of ordinary citizens who lived better than officers of the Reich, they were met with disbelief or anger. "You've been brainwashed," some said. But the men insisted they were telling the truth. What they had witnessed could not be forgotten. They described how they had been treated not as beasts, but as men. They told of American guards who shared cigarettes, of teachers who explained democracy, and of civilians who offered kindness instead of vengeance. To a people emerging from dictatorship and ruin, these testimonies carried a strange power, a glimmer of possibility that another kind of future was still attainable. In the years that followed, many of these former POWs would become the quiet foundation upon which a new Germany was built. They had been through the furnace of ideology and captivity and had emerged transformed. They had learned that democracy was not weakness, but resilience. Not chaos, but order through choice. Historians later referred to them as the America returnees. Though their numbers were small compared to the entire population, their influence was disproportionate. They brought back with them a first-hand understanding of a system that valued freedom and human dignity, and they carried that understanding into their post-war lives. Some became school teachers, eager to educate the next generation about truth and critical thinking. Others became journalists, determined to rebuild a press free from censorship and propaganda. A few entered politics, advocating for democratic reform and reconciliation with the West. Among these men were figures who would shape the destiny of modern Europe. Walter Hallstein, for instance, a captured officer who had experienced America's humane treatment firsthand, would later become one of the architects of the European Economic Community, the foundation of today's European Union. Others became diplomats, lawyers, and civic leaders, helping to rebuild a moral and democratic Germany from within. The transition was not easy. The first post-war years were marked by chaos and division. The Allied authorities faced the enormous challenge of denazification, removing the ideology of the Third Reich from public life. The process was often imperfect, but it created space for new voices to emerge, voices like those of the returnees, who spoke with authority born from experience. In conversations across towns and villages, they told stories of the America they had seen. They described cities that glowed at night, not with fire, but with electricity. They spoke of factories where workers and managers addressed each other by first names, of elections where leaders could be criticized without fear, and of a society where even prisoners of war were given dignity. These stories spread quietly, carried by word of mouth, by letters, and later by articles in emerging newspapers. To a population weary of tyranny and loss, the vision of such a world was both painful and hopeful. Painful because it revealed how far Germany had fallen. Hopeful because it showed that a better path existed. At the same time, the occupation authorities encouraged educational reforms that mirrored some of the lessons the POWs had already absorbed. Schools began teaching democratic principles. New textbooks emphasized individual responsibility and moral courage. Civics programs taught students about freedom of speech, the rule of law, and the importance of community. The former POWs were among the first to volunteer as instructors in these new systems. They saw education not as duty, but as redemption, a chance to ensure that their nation would never again be led into darkness by blind obedience. For many, the emotional struggle of reintegration was immense. They carried guilt for having served a regime responsible for atrocities, even if they had not personally committed them. The revelations of the Holocaust left deep scars. Some wrestled with shame so profound that they avoided public life entirely. Yet even in silence, their changed perspective influenced those around them, their families, their co-workers, their children. The post-war generation grew up hearing these quiet testimonies. When asked what America was like, the fathers would pause before answering, and then speak not of power or victory, but of fairness and opportunity. They described a place where even the defeated could be treated with respect, a lesson that shaped how they would later view justice, cooperation, and democracy. As West Germany began to rebuild under Allied guidance, this mindset became one of its hidden strengths. The new republic, founded in 1949, was built not on revenge, but on renewal. Its leaders emphasized moderation, compromise, and economic cooperation, principles that echoed what many had seen in America's society. In this sense, the transformation that began behind barbed wire fences in distant fields had come full circle. The United States had not only defeated an enemy army, it had sown the seeds of a democratic revival within that enemy's people. The re-education programs, often dismissed at the time as naive, proved remarkably effective. They demonstrated that lasting change comes not from punishment, but from understanding. The men who had once fought to destroy democracy became its advocates. The same hands that had built fortifications for tyranny now built homes, schools, and factories for freedom. By the early 1950s, West Germany had become one of the most stable democracies in Europe. Its rapid recovery, known as the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, astonished the world. Behind that success lay not only financial aid from the Marshall Plan, but also a psychological transformation that had begun years earlier in the quiet camps of Kansas, Texas, and Georgia. The former POWs often downplayed their experiences, modestly referring to their time in America as a period of reflection. Yet for many, it was the defining period of their lives. Some returned to the United States years later as visitors, standing on the same soil where they had once been prisoners. They visited the towns that had hosted their camps, sometimes meeting the families of the farmers they had worked for. There were tears, laughter, and long embraces. The fences were gone, but the memories remained. One such reunion took place in the early 1960s in Nebraska. A former German POW, now a teacher, returned to visit the farm where he had once worked during his captivity. The farmer's family welcomed him with open arms. Over dinner, they spoke not of war, but of life, of how strange and miraculous it was that enemies had become friends. The teacher later said, "I came here as a soldier, but I left as a human being." Such stories became part of the larger narrative of reconciliation between Germany and the United States. They served as living proof that humanity could bridge even the deepest divides. By the time the two nations became allies in the Cold War, much of the foundation for mutual trust had already been laid, not by diplomats or generals, but by the quiet transformation of thousands of men who had once been enemies. In hindsight, historians have called it one of the most successful examples of moral rehabilitation in modern history. It was not achieved through propaganda or coercion, but through consistency, decency, and example. The Americans had shown what freedom looked like, and in doing so, they had dismantled tyranny from within its own soldiers. As decades passed, the memory of those camps faded into history. Many of the barracks were torn down, the fields plowed over, the fences removed. Only a few plaques remained, quietly marking the sites where enemies had once stood face to face and discovered their shared humanity. Yet the legacy endured in the democratic institutions of modern Germany, in the peaceful cooperation that defines Europe today, and in the enduring friendship between two former foes. The story of the German prisoners of war in America was more than a footnote of World War II. It was a testament to the power of character over cruelty, of ideas over ideology, of compassion over conquest. It proved that victory could take many forms, and that sometimes the most profound triumphs are not won on battlefields, but in the human heart. The capture, from the deserts of North Africa to the unknown voyage. In the winter of 1943, the sun over North Africa burned white against a horizon littered with wrecked tanks, broken half-tracks, and shattered pride. The Africa Corps, once the symbol of Germany's invincible reach, was collapsing. The long columns of dust that rose over the desert were no longer German offensives pushing forward, but convoys of prisoners being herded toward the sea by Allied troops. Among those captured were battle-hardened soldiers, veterans of Tobruk, El Alamein, and countless smaller engagements fought across the barren expanse of sand. For them, the idea of defeat had always been inconceivable. They had been told that German courage and discipline could overcome any enemy. Now, surrounded by Americans and British forces, they began to see that the world outside their propaganda was far larger than they had imagined. Many of these men expected death. They had been warned that capture by the Americans meant starvation or execution. Yet as they marched toward makeshift collection camps, they noticed something strange. The American guards offered water, medical attention, even cigarettes. The prisoners were confused, too exhausted to speak much, but their minds were already beginning to register the first cracks in the stories they had been told. The Americans were not the monsters described by German propaganda. They were young, calm, and astonishingly well supplied. For the next several days, truck after truck carried the captured soldiers to ports along the North African coast. The scale of the Allied operation overwhelmed them. They saw mountains of crates stacked along harbors, endless rows of vehicles, ships larger than anything Germany had ever built. Some prisoners whispered that America must have sent everything it owned to Africa. None could yet imagine that what they were seeing was only a fraction of the American machine. When the first rumors spread that they were being sent to the United States, most laughed in disbelief. The ocean crossing seemed absurd. Why waste ships on prisoners when the war was still raging? But the Allied command had practical reasons. Europe's prison facilities were overcrowded, and the Atlantic convoys returning empty from delivering supplies could easily carry human cargo on the way back. So began one of the largest prisoner transports in modern history. At the ports of Oran, Casablanca, and Algiers, columns of prisoners were marched under guard to waiting Liberty ships. The Liberty, an American mass-produced cargo vessel, was itself a symbol of what the prisoners would soon come to understand: that the United States could create in months what took other nations years. Each ship was plain, unpainted steel, built not for beauty but for function. To the Germans, accustomed to the meticulous craftsmanship of their own engineers, the rough welding seemed crude, until they learned that thousands of such ships were being built at once. Life aboard was cramped and monotonous. The prisoners were confined to the lower holds, sleeping on narrow bunks stacked in tiers. The air smelled of oil and sweat and the salt of the sea. Guards patrolled quietly, offering food at regular intervals: tinned meat, white bread, fruit, and coffee. Even that simple meal astonished the Germans. Coffee in wartime? White bread. For many it was the first sign that the enemy they had been taught to despise lived in a world of plenty beyond comprehension. Days turned into weeks as the ships crossed the Atlantic under the constant threat of submarines. The Germans could hear the distant hum of escort destroyers and sometimes the sharp ping of sonar through the hull. Some lay awake at night wondering if their own comrades might torpedo them, unaware of who was inside. Yet the voyage was mostly uneventful. The Americans were methodical, disciplined, and, above all, efficient. Every routine was timed, every task recorded. The prisoners, used to the rigid order of the Wehrmacht, found themselves strangely respectful of this quiet, organized power. When the convoy finally neared the American coast, the atmosphere changed. Guards became less tense. Prisoners were allowed on deck for brief periods. One morning, through the mist, they saw the faint line of land. It grew quickly into a panorama of cranes, smokestacks, and endless piers. New York, Boston, and Norfolk received the first groups, and what they saw left them speechless. The skyline of modern America, untouched by war, glittered in the sunlight. No bomb craters, no ruins, no blackout curtains. Just a city alive with motion. For many, it was the first sign that the Reich could not win. Germany had already been fighting for survival. America had barely begun to fight and looked limitless. At the docks, the prisoners were marched off the ships and processed through military checkpoints. They were fingerprinted, examined by doctors, deloused, and issued identification tags. The procedures were quick, efficient, and respectful. Translators explained the rules of the Geneva Convention. Every man was guaranteed food, shelter, and medical care. The Germans listened in disbelief. In the deserts of North Africa, their own army had struggled to feed them. Now the enemy was promising proper treatment. They boarded trains that would take them inland to camps spread across the United States. Through the barred windows, they saw landscapes unlike anything they had known. Vast fields, rivers wide as lakes, towns dotted with factories and silos. There were no signs of war here. The tracks stretched endlessly, cutting through an abundance that felt surreal. A few prisoners murmured comparisons to Germany's crowded farmland. Here, everything seemed multiplied 100-fold. American civilians sometimes gathered near the tracks to watch the trains pass. Children waved. Some adults looked curious, others indifferent. Few showed hatred. The prisoners were stunned. Back home, civilians were taught to hate the enemy, to see them as subhuman threats. Yet here, the supposed enemy seemed almost casual about their presence. A prisoner later wrote in his diary that the Americans appeared to view the war as a distant storm, something happening elsewhere. As the trains moved deeper inland, the Germans noticed the scale of American industry. Smokestacks lined the horizons of cities. Freight trains passed loaded with machinery, tanks, and aircraft parts. They saw rows of new cars parked beside factories, not for civilians, since gasoline rationing limited driving, but waiting for military shipment. Everything moved in rhythm. The prisoners began to whisper among themselves. If this was what the enemy could build in peacetime conditions, what would happen once America fully turned to war? When they finally reached the first camps, the sight defied their expectations. The facilities were clean, organized, surrounded by barbed wire but not oppressive. Wooden barracks, mess halls, and recreation areas were laid out in neat rows. Each camp functioned like a small town, complete with hospitals, kitchens, and even libraries. The prisoners were issued work clothes and blankets. Guards explained that they could volunteer for labor, mostly agricultural or maintenance work, and would be paid in camp scrip redeemable at a canteen. The first nights were quiet. The men lay awake listening to the hum of distant trucks and the strange calm of an American evening. There were no sirens, no bombs, no fear of air raids. Some wept silently, not from grief but from the shock of peace. They realized that while Europe was being torn apart, the land outside the barbed wire was untouched, thriving, and free. Over the following weeks, interrogations were conducted not through threats but through conversation. American officers asked about units, supply chains, morale, and technology, but also about ordinary life in Germany. Many prisoners were surprised to find that their captors spoke fluent German, had studied their culture, even read Goethe and Schiller. It was a subtle but effective strategy. Respect created openness. The more human their captors appeared, the harder it was to cling to the idea of a superior race. Letters from home were allowed and carefully censored, but they brought a different kind of revelation. Families wrote of bombings, shortages, and despair. Cities like Hamburg and Cologne were being reduced to ashes. The prisoners compared these letters with the reality they saw around them. Factories running day and night, cities glowing with electricity, food served in abundance. The contrast grew unbearable. Slowly, an idea took root that perhaps everything they had believed about the war was false. In some camps, American officers began subtle education programs. They provided newspapers, magazines, and even films that showed everyday life in the United States. The prisoners saw images of democratic debate, of elections and strikes, of ordinary citizens criticizing their government without fear. They saw black and white workers laboring side by side, women building planes and driving trucks, children smiling under clear skies. The images seemed impossible. In Germany, such openness would have led to imprisonment. Yet here it was normal. The realization came gradually, almost painfully. They began to see that their defeat was not only military but ideological. The war they had fought was not against a weak and decadent democracy but against a nation whose power came from freedom itself. Factories built by ordinary citizens, not by forced labor. Soldiers motivated by belief, not terror. The prisoners started to understand the true nature of industrial democracy, its ability to inspire production through opportunity rather than coercion. For many, the first personal contact with Americans beyond guards came through farm work. The United States faced a labor shortage as millions of men went overseas, so POWs were sent to assist with planting and harvesting. They rode trucks through the countryside, guarded but treated politely. Farmers greeted them with wary curiosity, often surprised by their youth. Many prisoners were no older than 21. They worked long hours, ate alongside the farmhands, and discovered that the Americans trusted them far more than they expected. Some farmers allowed them to operate tractors or handle tools freely. They saw machines of extraordinary size and efficiency, harvesters that could reap acres in minutes. The sight of such abundance was humbling. At night, back in their camps, they spoke of what they had seen. The conversations were filled with awe. A few still insisted that Germany's technology was superior, that the Reich would soon unveil new weapons. But even they could not ignore the evidence. The Americans had achieved scale, something Germany could never match. It was not genius but numbers, not mysticism but machinery. When word reached the camps that American factories were producing a B-24 bomber every hour, most prisoners dismissed it as propaganda. Then, months later, they were shown photographs and newsreels confirming it. One man, a former Luftwaffe mechanic, stared at the images for a long time before whispering that Germany could not even produce spare parts that quickly. For the first time, despair turned into reflection. How could a democracy, mocked for its chaos and weakness, outproduce a nation that claimed to embody order and discipline? By the end of 1943, the psychological shift had begun. These men, once symbols of Germany's pride, were quietly absorbing the lesson of America's might, not just in factories and fields, but in ideals. The idea that strength could coexist with mercy, that abundance could come from cooperation rather than conquest, was alien to everything they had been taught. Yet it surrounded them every day, undeniable as the landscape beyond the wire. The journey from North Africa to America had taken only a few weeks, but for the men inside those camps, it marked the beginning of a far longer voyage, the journey from belief to doubt, from indoctrination to understanding. They did not yet know it, but the transformation that would change their lives and help reshape post-war Germany had already begun. Ending the quiet victory. By the time the war ended in 1945, more than 371,000 German prisoners of war had lived and worked in camps across the United States. They had planted crops, built roads, and labored in sawmills and canneries. They had seen America not through propaganda or military briefings, but with their own eyes. What they witnessed reshaped them in ways no speech or re-education pamphlet ever could. When the news of Hitler's death reached the camps, the reaction was subdued. Some prisoners cheered quietly, others wept, but most simply stared into the distance. The man who had promised them victory and destiny had led them instead to captivity. And yet, their lives as captives had revealed a truth they could never have imagined inside the Reich. That the strength of a nation did not come from fear, nor from obedience, but from freedom and faith in ordinary people. The months that followed were filled with uncertainty. Repatriation began slowly. The prisoners were sent home in groups, by ship, across the same ocean they had crossed in chains years earlier. This time, they looked back at the American coastlines with a strange sense of gratitude. They had arrived as soldiers of an empire and were leaving as witnesses to a new kind of civilization. When they returned to Germany, what they found was unrecognizable. Cities that had once embodied pride and culture were now ruins of stone and dust. Streets were silent, hunger was everywhere, and families searched the rubble for loved ones. The former POWs, those who had lived years surrounded by American abundance, became quiet carriers of a new perspective. They spoke of clean camps, of fairness, of kindness from strangers who owed them nothing. They spoke of farms larger than towns, of women working in factories, of a democracy that seemed chaotic yet unstoppable. In the chaos of occupation, these men began to serve a new purpose. Some helped organize local councils, others worked as interpreters or labor supervisors for Allied authorities. A few became educators in reorientation programs designed to rebuild a democratic Germany. What began as a policy of containment had transformed into a human bridge between former enemies. Among them were men who would later help rebuild Europe. Walter Hallstein, once a soldier captured in France, went on to become a key architect of the European Economic Community, the foundation of today's European Union. Many others, unknown to history, carried the same lesson into their homes and workplaces. That democracy was not weakness, and compassion was not defeat. The re-education of German prisoners in America was not achieved through lectures or slogans. It happened through the quiet power of example. The prisoners had been allowed to see America as it truly was, imperfect, yet free, unequal, yet striving, immense, yet humane. They saw that prosperity could be shared, that justice could exist even in wartime, and that a nation could be strong without being cruel. When historians later examined the records, they found a striking statistic. Less than 1% of all German POWs held in the United States attempted escape. Most did not want to. They felt safer, more respected, and more human behind American fences than they had ever felt inside the regime they had served. Long after the war, letters continued to cross the Atlantic. Former prisoners wrote to the families who had employed or befriended them, sending thanks, photographs, and stories of rebuilding. Some even returned to visit the places where they had once been held, standing at the edges of empty fields where the camps had been dismantled. They found nothing left but the wind and the memory of a strange paradox, that captivity had freed them from illusion. In the end, America's victory over these men was not won by bombs or bullets, but by ideas made real, by factories that never stopped turning, by lights that never went out, and by the quiet decency of a people who treated their enemies as human beings. The prisoners came as believers in a false destiny. They left as witnesses to a greater truth. And in their hearts, across oceans and generations, the lesson endured, that freedom, when lived with conviction, is the most powerful weapon of all.